welcome. And I have to say personally to connect. So Jimena actually, when we built the Indigenous pathway for the Indigenous network, Jimena is the one who introduced me to this concept and was my professor at McGill. So I have to give you gratitude for teaching me and being, I think, a foundational space of learning for me to now get to do this wonderful work in food. And then Robbie and I met, I think it was a year ago, through some of the work I was doing in the community, and I have we shared that experience of in care and being in Alberta, and I am just grateful that you are here and that we get to share this relational space and talk about food. Yeah. Okay, so we talked about, when we were talking about this idea, I wanted to first start quickly with, what is resurgence? Show of hands, who knows what resurgence is? Who's heard this word before? The simplest way I can put it is a restoration of what was. In a lot of ways, I find reconciliation and decolonization to be focused on the system of power and colonialism as a colonial project. I'm more interested in this restoration of what was already here. What were these reciprocal relationships to land, and how do we bring them about, and how do we, as a broader, all the races of the world, come together to restore the land sovereignty, food sovereignty, rights to food, but also the living nature of these living things. So we're really looking at understanding food insecurity from this indigenized perspective and looking at these disproportionate levels that we continue to see in our communities due to this combination of historical injustices, systemic barriers, as well. I'm sure you've seen in your various programming the challenges that show up here in Quebec, the complexities of the federal act, that is the Indian Act, and then the complications of that being existing in a provincial space like Quebec as additional barriers, as it does in all provinces. And so we really want to build a conversation around the natural innateness of how we hold a wealth of knowledge, innovative solutions, resilience that is rooted in traditional practices and contemporary strategies. So without further ado, let's get started and some questions. So this first question is for all of us, really. Food is not just sustenance, but it's also a crucial part of cultural identity and traditions. So how do you see relationships between food and cultural preservation in Indigenous communities? And maybe we'll start with Robbie.
Hi everyone, my name is Robbie Matson. I am a Two-Spirit Cree originally from Alberta. And I like to mention when I do these events that Robbie Matson is my post-Euro-colonial name. My real name is Ipitak Peaceful Mostis, which in Cree means here's the voice of the buffalo. In French, it's Qui entend la voix du son, and in Ojibwe, it's Nikuterije Mshloni Biziki. And I always acknowledge the Ojibwe version of it because when I received the name in official ceremony, they came to the seer in Ojibwe. So I had to have it translated. And when I was in Toronto, I was in and out of Toronto for years and living there continuously from 2013 to 2016. And we have a lot of elders there that come around to do events like this and talk to us about all kinds of things. And one of the things that we learned was that food is first medicine. It is the most important thing. It comes before any other form of medicine. And not only is it important to realize that, it's also important to read that Indigenous foods original to Turtle Island is first medicine also. We have a lot of foods here, and foods, quote unquote foods, that are not indigenous to Turtle Island, that are not native to Turtle Island at all, and that actually do quite a lot of damage and are still doing a lot of damage to the indigenous communities. So it's important to stay in connection with those foods that are, that are important to us and best for our system, in line with what our genes are, our biology. And I'm glad to be here to discuss my views on that today. But that's kind of how I see it.
Thank you, Robbie. Same question.
Okay, hello everybody. I think when I was thinking about this question, the central food that came to me as somebody that, grew up in Mexico, is corn, right? Maíz. And in working with indigenous peoples in Mexico that is a colonized word. Maíz is not the indigenous word, right? So like the Nahua from Mexico, in the region of Mexico City is Simki. And so these words, right? So corn, especially, when we look at a lot of the origin stories, corn is not a food, it is actually what we are made of, right? And so I'll give you one example, right? So if we look at the Popol Vuh, which is the origin story of the Mayan people from the Yucatan in Guatemala, which hold corn very sacred. In that origin story, creators started creating people out of clay and they crumbled, out of mud and they crumbled, and suddenly they said, okay, we have to use white and yellow corn, and they came alive. And so those twins, which are the central figures of that story, became the sun and the moon and separated the night and the day. So corn, the relationship to corn when you grow up in those regions and those stories is a connection to that, to those ancestors, to the land. And so a lot of people, for example, still leave offerings on the fields. So if you think of that relationship and then you think of modified seeds of corn that are made for productivity, you see what a sacrilege it is to treat that plant just from a productive, like how much can we make this yield, right? Just like a cow or, like this thing that you take out of, right? And the relationship to some of these foods is so deep, right? And so I wanted to kind of bring that story just through the growth. But if we look at hunting traditions, right, because we have a lot of hunting, the animals, right? Some of these animals were not just food. They were relatives, they were friends, they were teachers. If you received visions from them in dreams, right, how to use the medicines, they were sources of food that sacrificed themselves, right? So I think that it is so much more, right, than sustenance, and it feeds, right, the soul and the spirit. And if you take the time to learn about where you are and who the custodians of that land are and what is their relationship to food, right? Because we're on Haudenosaunee territory, the Three Sisters, they have their own relationship to corn, which is slightly different, right, from the one that we had in South America, and yet similar in some ways, right? So I think that those were the two kind of stories I wanted to bring.
I love it. And you bring in an important part about this, like this geographical context of the knowledge. There's a tendency in like indigenous rhetoric or discourse to say, well, my indigenous friend said this, and therefore this is truth. But from an indigenous worldview, we know that there are many truths. And those many truths are informed and defined by the geographical context with which we exist and situate ourselves. And so I think what becomes even more complex is in these urban areas where many of our programs exist and operate, whereby we've got a ton of folks from the north coming in, and how do we ensure that there's Inuit sovereignty engaged in our programming? But then also, how do we look at the Haudenosaunee teachings in tandem with the land? But then also recognizing, because of displacement, we're going to see other folks who aren't native to this land. And so how do we make space, I think, for that? Something that I thought of while you were sharing, Jimena, was this idea of getting to know your own cultural ways of knowing food. I believe inherent in every individual is a culture of food. I always laugh at the example of like, I really love kubasa and pierogies. Because I think sometimes we see whiteness as there's nothing there beyond whiteness, but whiteness is not so much as the person of the color of the skin, but an ideology, a way of being where whiteness has become superior to all. But underneath that, prior to colonization, I think there is a unique culture, and there's no way for you to appreciate our unique relationships and cultures to food if you have no idea what the hell your own are, right? And so I encourage you, as a conclusion, I think, to this is, as you hear us and as you engage in these conversations, take that knowledge as well to yourself, to empower yourself to understand your family's culture. And we see culture one way, but I see culture in a broader sense of how you choose to identify and how you then relate to the environment around you. So what are the teachings from your grandparents? What are the teachings in your communities? All of these things, I think, become a part of what culture means to you. Now I'm going to transition us a bit, and this one question is for you, Jimena. Can you share some insights into how traditional Indigenous food systems functioned and their importance in maintaining community health and sustainability?
So and this is also something that you talked about, right? When we talk about food, and this is something you know, it's connected to everything, right? It's connected when we think of the relationship to the land, but also to health, to healing, to governance, to maturing, to education, right? So when we look at some of the traditional food systems, and I think often about the Arctic, right? Because when we think about the Arctic, the Western perspective was there's nothing there. It's a desert. There was this misconception that it's just ice, right? But why did people go there in the first place? Because there was food. They were following the food, and there was a lot of food. There were a lot of mammals, there was a lot of food. But in order to get that food in that very harsh environment, your whole culture, your whole way of being had to align with that food, right? So you travel with the food, with the seasons, right? You learn the skills needed to hunt those animals, and you develop, for example, patience, right? The Inuit hunter waiting for hours on end on the seal hole for it to emerge. So every part, like spirituality, right? The Angakuk, the traditional Inuit shamans talking with the spirits of the animals, trying to find and fight famine. So everything about that was sustainable, right? Because there was no waste, it was not for profit, right? Everything was used of those animals, the sinew, the bones, everything was built. You have to think there are no trees, right? So how do you build stuff, right? You use the bones, you use everything. But in order to have that sustainable relationship, you need to have an emotional and personal connection to those animals. There were rituals when seals were killed, and I think those are still practiced today. For example, there was a prayer, and they would receive a little bit of water as the last, like the last rite, offering water to the seal. And this was very foreign. I think when Westerners came and saw animals just as, goods and for fur, we saw that balance got, affected. Because then people were like, oh, you have to hunt in order to bring these to, the hunts, it's the post to get money. So this is where you start to break the balance in that also relationship of sustainability and of reciprocity to the land and to food, right? So I think that we're going to talk about those things after. Yes.
And I think it presents an interesting challenge in how we set up organizations and structures in this world. How do we maintain a sustainable program or nurture this sustainable life cycle in a 3-year grant program that has a beginning, middle, and end? It becomes an additional, I think, challenge. And I wanted to see, Robbie, if you had any reflections you wanted to add in.
No, she pretty much covered it. I'm actually still thinking about some of the things she just said. So, no, not right now, actually.
And so I have this question again for all of us, and whoever wants to take it first can, but what are some of the key barriers that Indigenous communities are facing today in terms of accessing traditional food?
Okay, well, one of the big problems is we're often not told the truth about the food that we're eating, and that's available to us. That's a big problem. So, miseducation is a big issue, and I think we need to become more specific about the foods that we're eating and what they actually contain, so that Indigenous people and in particular our youth can make healthy choices and decisions. So I see that as a major barrier there, as misinformation and deliberate hiding of the negative side effects of certain kinds of food from us, and it is going on. So I see that as a particularly big issue for Indigenous people.
In terms of this miseducation, I always come back to Ben because I can't tell you how many events I've been to, and they're like, "We've got Indigenous traditional food, guys." and we laugh about it because Bannock was a survival dish. It is a resilience dish of ingredients introduced from the colonial project. that kept our people alive so that we can be here and be before each and every one of you today. And so when I said in that last part about these pan-Indigenous, you really need to engage with the communities of Indigenous people who you serve. So what are those feedback loops with the communities you serve uniquely, and how do they make space to share what traditional foods are important to them?
Yeah, when I was thinking about, kind of the key barriers, I think the whole colonial system was the key barrier to removing people from the land and from their foods. If people are strong and healthy, they're gonna fight for their land. So the first thing you give them is food that is not healthy. White flour, sugar, like some of the basic things that will deplete you, not nourish you, and disconnect you from those very deep relationships to the food, right? So if we think of relocation, people being removed from their territory, we talk about reserves and confining them to a fraction of their territory, right? And then forced settlement. We think of the hunters going forced to live in places, villages year-round, when that is totally not organic to their relationship to the food. And so you create famine because the food went that way and you did not follow, right? And so when you're in a situation of famine, you're in a situation of vulnerability, which is what gives colonial powers power over people, right? So I think that all of these systems and capitalism and exploitation, right? Why do you remove people from the land in order to access mining, foresting, and when I think back in Mexico, a lot of those traditional lands, which now are protected lands, through corruption, private companies get them, right? So there's different levels. So even when there's protected lands, there's places in the world where you can pay sufficient money to actually drill protected lands, right? So, I mean, how people have survived, like we have to really recognize how Indigenous people have still been able to get to those foods despite the walls and the barriers and the ditches that you have to jump over to get to those medicines.
Because basically, as far as I'm concerned, there was no such thing as Indigenous food insecurity on Turtle Island until they came here and brought money into the situation. The system we have now is the more money you have, the more food you have, the more paper you have. And this is the crazy thing, because the people that came here colonized go around saying very, very foolish, silly things. And one of them you keep hearing them saying is, money doesn't grow on trees. Where in fact it does. And it is the freaking trees. So this is what I'm noticing as an Indigenous person growing up here. Thinking, okay, what is wrong with these people? This is not normal. That's an example. So, it's true. There was no food insecurity before they came here with the money system because we hunted. They made it so that they basically wiped out the buffaloes. On that one animal, we could get the 6 major things, elements that we needed to live off that one creature, and they wiped them out. That was one of the first things that they did. So there was no food insecurity, and we didn't take the way I guess the Europeans do when it came to food. She was saying it was about respect. You pray to the spirit of that animal. You lay tobacco down if you see one that happens to be dying. The relationship with our food was very different, and we only took what we needed. So.
But when you speak of the buffalo, when the railroad tracks were being built out west, they knew that as long as you had buffalo, you would have those warriors. So buffalo were systemically slaughtered, not even for furs, they were left to rot on the plains, to bring to their knees the Sioux, the Lakota, all of these very powerful warriors who were afraid of nothing. I mean, and it was really, they're like, okay, if you get the buffalo, you will get to them. You will bring these people to their knees, right? And slowly, I think, as the buffalo is reintroduced, you talk about resurgence, right? Maybe they're just 1,000, they're no longer millions, but to bring that animal back and to bring it to that place of respect is a form, I think, of regaining some of the food sovereignty and reclaiming some of that relationship to the land and to the animals. But we have to think of how like disastrous, like Indigenous writers talk about post-apocalyptic era. Right? What would be the worst thing that could possibly happen to you that the buffalo would need to kill?
And I think this idea of how the colonial project builds its own problems and then seeks to solve it is sometimes what happens in our organizations, in our centers. We do things for, not with. And so it's important, again, I'll bring it back to that feedback loop, those engaged spaces whereby we're understanding what our unique community needs and what that makeup is, and using that to inform so that we're not, again, repeating that cyclical harm that we see, that though can be well-intended, ends up continuing to reinforce that cyclical systemic harm. And so this question is going to go for Robbie here. And could you tell us about your personal experiences around food insecurity and then how it has impacted you and your community?
For sure. I was really happy when you invited me to come and do this panel because I happened to be looking around at some food labels that we see on everyday food item boxes and containers and stuff that we see in all kinds of stores, and noticed some pretty vast discrepancies there that I thought were so interesting. I didn't know who to present it to. I should call the media or wait for an event to come up, or this is the perfect event. Having lived in Toronto before and being able to compare the Indigenous community in that city to how things are operating here in Montreal, one distinct difference that I can talk about, and that really needs to change is that they are talking about diabetes way, way, way more in the Toronto area than they are talking about it here. It's almost systemic. All the organizations in Toronto related to the Indigenous community, this diabetes thing, education comes around like a circle on a regular basis. I think it's very important that we start talking a lot about it here. And one of the major problems that we have here, and I think in particular about our youth, is that they don't know how to read food labels or what the information on those labels mean or what they equal. Part of that is deliberate deceit from one side of the food industry compared to what Health Canada is saying. And I actually brought some items here to demonstrate what I'm talking about. And I would like to talk in particular right now about white sugar, because that is the big problem. It is foreign to Turtle Island, and Indigenous people, by and large, do not have the blood for this stuff. And it shows in our results. The 1.7 million registered First Nations people we have living on Turtle Island, 12.7% of them have diabetes. On the Métis side, the numbers of 9.9% of the Métis population suffer from diabetes. The general population, less than 5%. So why do we have double the numbers in our communities of people with diabetes compared to those in other communities? Again, we don't have the blood for white sugar, and this education about what the white sugar, what it really is, and the actual effects of it. So I'm going to point to you right now to some items that I brought.
You want to hold your mic?
Yes. Okay. These are everyday packagings that we see in grocery stores. Everyone's heard of Ritz crackers. Everyone's seen that. Most people are familiar with these chocolatey treats, granola bars and stuff that people buy as quick snacks. We have that.
My favorite.
we have a can of roasted peanuts here. And my favorite for this demonstration, an empty plastic bottle of Pepsi. Now, on these labels, on all of them, and I'm going to pass one of the boxes around so you guys can see. Here's your food label right here. Now, on this side, which is my right to your left, we have a list here of things that are contained within this particular product. So we have fat, carbohydrates, protein, sodium, potassium. Now, where the sugar is listed, it says 69 grams of sugar in this particular bottle. This is on my right. On the left, you have the recommended daily percentage that they're saying you're supposed to take in an an average day. So if we go by this label, they're saying that 69 grams of sugar equals 69% of the total you're supposed to have in a day. So we can make out that what they're telling us is that 1 gram of sugar makes up 1% of the total you're supposed to take. If you look on these other 3 items here, these boxes, it's the exact same thing. So that's what's being told. So the consumer is led to believe that they should be aiming for in the area of 100 grams of sugar a day. If you go onto Google right now and you look at what Health Canada says the daily intake of white sugar should be, for in women, the high total should be 25 grams of sugar, and this is added sugar, and in men, 36 grams. So where the men are concerned, a label like we have here, the way it's listed here, would lead the consumer to believe that they would be looking to take 3 times the high dose recommended by Health Canada. Because, according to them, 1 gram of sugar equals 1% of the daily total you're supposed to be taking. And the 36 grams is the North American norm. The American Heart Association also says 36 grams is supposed to be the top for a typical North American male. Now, without this particular information, in North America, the daily average sugar that a North American person is consuming is basically, it comes out to about 88 grams. Let's look at a list of the 12 top health problems that people who consume this much sugar in a day are known for suffering from. Weight gain, heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, liver disease, tooth cavities, poor sleep, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, mood problems, gout, kidney stones, and advanced unnatural forms of aging. Well, I'm going to show you guys a demonstration now, the visual, of what the amount of sugar in here actually looks like to the human eye. If you have anyone in your family, any young people or anyone you know that you think is consuming too much sugar and you want them to understand the difference, if you show it to them like I'm going to show it to you now, they will get it.
We step into the laboratory now, we're doing a steam change, everyone. Yes.
So I have here a little container of white granulated sugar that I brought from home. And I'm going to take it out.
And I think while you're opening it up too, it's like this, growing up like in care and in shelters, these types of foods became the most consumed accessible foods because they were not perishable. And so in so many ways, before we even knew that there was harm being done to our bodies, harm was being done.
Yes, it was. Oh. Okay, so how do you know exactly how much white sugar are in any of these items? If you go by what the Diabetes Association in Toronto tells us, you take the number of grams of sugar listed on the food label and you divide that by 4. Your answer tells you how many teaspoons of white granulated sugar is in this particular product. So we have 69 grams of sugar in this particular product. When you divide that by 4, it gives you 17. 17 teaspoons of white sugar in this one little bottle. Let's look at what 17 teaspoons of white sugar looks like in the visual. I'm loving this. I feel like I'm in this So I have here a teaspoon and a see-through Ziploc sandwich bag. Ziploc because I'm going to send it around after so you guys can feel how heavy this is and so none of the sugar will escape. So we open our sugar container. I'll leave that on the floor for now.
Yeah, it's a safe spot.
So, 1,
Everyone 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. That's it. You said it fast, that is gross.
And so, by visual, we now know that in this empty Pepsi bottle that used to have pop in it, there was this much white sugar in this one bottle. These labels are encouraging you to take 3 times this amount. 69 grams is already twice the daily max what Health Canada is saying is supposed to be consumed. Not knowing these things is a big problem in our community. We're not talking about it enough. I'd like to start it, and I just thought that today would be a great platform to do so. So I'm going to bring this. I'm going to let you guys feel this and have a look at what this looks like.
And you bring such an important conversation to the mix of what we can do as organizations in recognizing where we're at as a society means that things like nutrition labels are here and present. And so how do we operate in this middle ground of what foods are accessible for us? We need to teach our young people and all people. I argue my mom doesn't know how to read a food. So how do we make spaces for providing education that reflects where we're at, knowing that we're still hoping towards to go to a better outcome in the future?
Yes, and also another point to make is that there are close to 40 different names for white sugar that turn up on food labels. The 5 most common ones you see are glucose, fructose, dextrose, maltose, and sucralose. All those terms mean white sugar. We find it obviously in soft drinks, energy drinks, fruit-flavored drinks, fruit juices, sports drinks, hot chocolates, specialty coffees, cakes, candies, chocolate, cookies, donuts, ice cream. In other words, everything that is foreign to Turtle Island normally in the food bracket has white sugar. So this is basically what I wanted to come and tell you guys today. I hope you guys retain it, and that when you get opportunities to share it with other people, you do, because it's very, very important that our communities understand what these labels mean, and in particular our youth. So they know what they're eating. The only way, I think, in my own common sense way of thinking, the only way we'll be able to eradicate diabetes from our community is if we stop consuming this crap. And if we understand what we're doing, or we at least cut it out as much as we possibly can. It'll take centuries before we get rid of that illness. But if we want future generations to thrive, I have to start doing it in my lifetime while I'm still alive. So I want to thank you for letting me come and present that to you today, and that was a great opportunity. And as I said, I hope it made sense to some of you, and some of you understand it now better than you understood it before. This is all researchable stuff. If you go to the Diabetes Association, they'll tell you the exact same thing that I just presented to you. That's where I got it. Only I heard it in Toronto. I think we need to make the information a little bit more common here.
Thank you so much, Robbie. And taking that practice and what we kind of currently exists, and maybe for you, and like, how did historical policies and practices contribute to the current state of food insecurity in Indigenous communities?
I mean, I think, Robbie, you did mention a lot of it. I mean, when we think of, what happened to people being put on reserves, right? So if you cut the access to traditional foods, so traditional foods that you have to go hunt or gather, so you have to move, right? You have to already expend, like, your body had to actually do something, right? So you had exercise that was built in, and then what you got was varied. There was fiber, there was protein, and some of the sugars were in the berries, basically. And then, there were sugar bushes here in this kind of area. But those were treats, right? So if you replace that very nourishing at all levels diet with white sugar, white, what's it called, flour, right? And then like very little protein that is disconnected from, traditional practices from hunting, you break down people, literally, right? And I think that the connection that I hear is also, why do we have that high percentage, is because this leads to poverty. I mean, this is the cheap food. And coming from Latin America, I can tell you that there's an obesity problem across Latin America, and kids drink these 2-liter ones, one a day, because it is cheap, right? And if you're hot and you're thirsty and you think that's better than water, especially when there's no drinkable water, which is true in a lot of communities and it's true in a lot of places in Latin America, well, then you don't get salmonella or, these diseases, and you drink your Pepsi or your Coca-Cola, right? And that becomes, this from a very young age, right? So I think that when we think of the policies that we're putting in place, for me, one is education. When state-imposed education told kids, go sit in the classroom and this is how you learn how to be a good, Canadian, Mexican, whatever, you already disconnected them from learning from their elders, which was through observation and on the land. How did you learn which plants you could eat? You followed your grandmother or your parents around and you learned. How did you learn how to hunt? You started at a very, so that type of education was not recognized by the Canadian or any of the colonial systems, right? So by putting these kids forcefully in these, and communities were forced, and we know the history of residential schools, but even day schools were forced, right? So that's how you start to break these things, right? You break that learning that happens of how to get these foods, right? And so these kids after, they don't know how to get food other than by going to the store. That's how you get food. They don't know what grows in their backyard. They don't know how to get food on their own, which it's a lifelong learning, right? You can't improvise it's a big work of reclaiming that knowledge if you didn't start very, very early on, right? So I think that's one of the main kind of policies that was put in place at different time frames in different places, but that for me, education or diseducation or miseducation, we don't have a word for it. That really breaks down that learning and that food. And as you said, Indigenous peoples were completely autonomous. There was no food insecurity, but that was the threat. That was the threat. So now when we think of these communities being food insecure, that is completely created by the Canadian government, that now goes oh, now we have to pay for, social, but you created that in that first place. These people were completely autonomous, right? And I like the story about adding sugar, because I want an anecdote, right? So where does chocolate come from? Mexico. It was money. Cocoa beans was the money that was used to buy things on the market. That was so important, right? You traded using the cocoa beans. You didn't grind it and put sugar in it and drink it. You traded with it. The only person that got to drink hot chocolate was the emperor. He didn't put sugar in it. He put mushrooms in it. Those kinds of mushrooms. The mushrooms that kind of make you see it. And it was the Spanish were oh, this is bitter. Let's add sugar to it. And they invented what we call, Western chocolate. So it's, you could see the difference already between the relationship to the cacao, and then with chocolate, we filled it with sugar, so it's not bitter. Anyway, that was my chocolate.
No, I think that's really helpful, and I think a lot of these things, I hope there's some nugget of wisdom. And as we're kind of coming to our final 2 questions before we open up space for a Q&A, I was kind of hoping we've looked at history, looked at the present. In terms of kind of looking forward, what would be your vision for food sovereignty in Indigenous communities, and maybe a couple of steps that would need to be taken for that to be realized?
Well, we should stop lying about what we're eating. That's the most obvious. As far as I'm concerned, this is a blatant lie. This is very, very deceiving. And the consumer who doesn't know any better is getting sicker all the time because they don't understand how to read these labels. And there's just too much of a disparity between what Health Canada is saying should be the top sugar amount we take in a day and what they're saying it is for one side here not to be lying. But it shows you how they're allowed companies, like Pepsi Cola, Christie, General Mills, all of them, they all know exactly what's going on. They are permitted to put these lies on these labels, and it's at the expense of the people that are buying this stuff, whether it's food or soft drinks or whatever. That needs to stop. So I think that in the future, I think society, one of the things they need to work on is getting the story straight and holding them accountable for the bullshit, basically, that they're putting in front of us. That's one of the most obvious things.
When I think of kind of the community-led initiatives you talked about, the first thing that came to mind was gardens. And I mean, I think community-led gardens are places where young people learn about food and develop their relationships with food. And I think urban community gardens, when you were talking about displaced people, people who have, for X or Y reason ended up in big cities, this was not necessarily their land. Well, you still are on the land, right? You still have to develop that relationship, right? So I think that community gardens cannot be underestimated. I think it's an amazing initiative that I think a lot of you work on, because that's like, we go back to the education. How do you redevelop and rekindle that relationship to food? Well, you have to start and get your hands dirty. Like how do you plant it? How do you sow it? How do you, starting to learn from those foods and the foods that are from this land. And I think a lot of Indigenous communities working with young people, like reteaching fishing, reteaching, getting intergenerational learning, where you have elders that do these initiatives. There's a lot of land-based camps, hunting camps, fishing camps, and there's that period of, are the youth going to be interested? And guess what? They are, because it's fun. I mean, they get a great sense of satisfaction from fishing, from getting their own food, and they realize they have this power to feed themselves. It's like, I didn't know I could do that, right? And I think that a lot of those initiatives that are happening are very hopeful. They don't make the evening news.
Sometimes.
Right? But most of the time, we don't hear about them in the media, right? Because they don't, they reinforce the idea of sovereignty, right, and autonomy. And I think that a lot of communities are doing a lot to reconnect the youth with those. They're not going to do it in the same necessarily way their ancestors are. They're going to bring, they're going to learn on skidoos or using, modern equipment, which is fine, right? The main thing is to reconnect to that food and to rebuild that relationship. And so then you can have more kind of awareness and go like, I don't need a Pepsi, I don't need the chips, I don't need this stuff. This actually is not feeding my spirit. It just gives me a high and a buzz, and then a low and a crash, and it doesn't sustain me. So if kids start to have that experience of what does it feel like to be nourished and sustained and connected to food, they're gonna, we know it, it feels good, right? And that feels healthy, and that kind of leads to other generations teaching their kids, it's like language transmission. You have to, even if it's broken, you can always relearn it and retransmit it to the next generation.
And I've actually, all the time that I've been doing outreach work, whether it's in Toronto or Montreal, we do, there are a lot of interests where we go to community gardens to plant things, to do seeding ceremonies or whatever. And in the 15 years that I've been doing it, I've never gone out to an occasion like this where someone said, oh, you know what, this really sucks, it's boring out. Never happened. It's always more or less a circle develops, and then we just start talking about all kinds of things, and there's usually a lot of healing involved. And I was on a radio show last week, and we were talking about this, and I was saying gardening has got to be one of the most obvious forms to reconnect to the culture, because that's who we were before colonization started. So, you're there, you have your hands in the dirt, literally. It's pretty hard not to make the connection. So it's really important that we keep community gardens going and programs and places like this one and like Khmer, who I do a lot of work for, because in the big cities, as the cities get bigger and there's more pollution, it gets harder and harder to stay in connection with the culture. And gardening is the fast track to doing it. So organizations like this one and community gardens, very important for sure.
We actually made, in Hochelaga, we made a garden, Fred and I, on our balcony. I'm really excited about it. But I think what it taught me is, and what you both, I think, say is like body sovereignty, and it has at an individual level that we need to empower our own bodies within the experience. In so many ways, the Colonial Project has sought to commodify each individual body. You become a product to move something forward. So you've lost your sense of self. And so how do we, as workers in community food centers, model this for communities? Well, we need to start with ourselves and recognize that we have a responsibility to our individual self, but in tandem with a relationship to the community with which we situate ourselves in. I think in this discussion, this panel, like our seed swap outside, I hope that there's been a seed of knowledge that has been planted. And for those of you who still have questions, firstly, I actually encourage you to sit in the question, because I think sometimes we don't have to have all the answers right now, and we're not comfortable sitting in the questions. So keep those questions, hold them near and dear to your heart. I want to take a moment to thank Amanda and Robbie and myself for sharing.